Remember that feeling you had after taking time to pick out that perfect game to rent at the video store and you couldn't wait to spend all weekend playing it, only to find out that the game is terrible? Then you'll want to see my top 10 disappointing moments in retro gaming. Let's get started. If this is your first time here at the channel, my name is Tyler, and if you love gaming from all generations like we do here at G3, then consider hitting that subscribe button and hit that bell for notifications so you don't miss anything. Number 10 on our list is a game I first saw at my local video store to rent, and it's actually Luigi's first starring role in a video game. And no, it's not Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube. I'm talking about the 1993 NES title Mario is Missing. The box art looks great, with Luigi finally getting his time in the spotlight while Bowser is snatching Mario away in the background. And when I looked at the back of the box, the gameplay looked very similar to Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, and this game was on the NES, so I thought this game had to be amazing. So I get it home that day and quickly realized that not only does this game not capture the essence of previous Mario games, but it's actually an educational game. I mean, really, why do we need a Mario-themed education game? The basic premise of the game is that Bowser has kidnapped Mario and plans to destroy the world by melting the polar ice caps with tons of hair dryers. Yes, you heard that right, hair dryers. And to fund this operation, Bowser is sending his minions all over the world to gather treasures like the Mona Lisa that he can use to sell and buy all those hair dryers he needs. Yeah! It's up to Luigi to go all over the world and get the items before Bowser, and he has to ask around and gather information about different cities and landmarks around the world. It's basically Mario meets Carmen Sandiego, and shame on Software Toolworks Company for publishing this deceiving game, which is basically the 1993 definition of clickbait. The next disappointing moment on our list comes from an iconic video game franchise that debuted in 1993 as well. NBA Jam was everywhere that year. You couldn't go to any arcade, pizza joint, bowling alley, or department store without seeing people huddled around one of these amazing arcade cabinets. This over-the-top 2-on-2 basketball phenomenon with photorealistic likenesses of licensed NBA players was unlike any other basketball game before its time. And my favorite team to play with was the Orlando Magic, where you could play as Shaquille O'Neal. 1993 was the same year that Shaq won NBA Rookie of the Year, and he was in every magazine or commercial you could think of. And in March of '94, NBA Jam finally got ports on home consoles like the Sega Genesis and the SNES. I got my own copy for the Genesis not long after its release. And number 9 on my most disappointing moment in retro gaming is realizing that Shaq is nowhere to be found on the home ports of NBA Jam. Basically, Shaq pulled a Michael Jordan and purchased the rights to his name and likeness from the NBA before the home ports were made. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still love the Genesis port of NBA Jam, and it's one of my favorite sports titles to this day. But I still remember being pretty bummed for a while, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one upset about it. Number 8 is one of those games that I truly think is one of the best original Game Boy games of all time, especially its storyline, but I think it was just too complex of a game for the limited technology in '91 when it was released. I'm talking about Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Now, I'm a big fan of the Metroid franchise, and I love all the exploring and discovering you have to do to advance in the games. But I'm sure some of you can agree that the non-linear style of the original Metroid on the NES was really hard to follow because there was no in-game map like there are in the later installments in the series. So when the sequel came out on the Game Boy, you have a similar gameplay style to the original, with once again the lack of a map system. On a game that's played on a very small screen with basically no color palette, I found it extremely hard to follow and figure out how to make any progress. I played this game for about a week and it really felt like I was just going around in circles, so I basically put it on the shelf until I found a copy of the December 1991 issue of Nintendo Power years later and played it on my Game Boy Color, which had a special enhanced color palette for Metroid 2, and it makes the experience so much better. Again, now don't take this as me not liking Metroid 2. I think it's a wonderful game. Just its presentation on the original Game Boy screen was very disappointing and frustrating to me. And if you love Metroid 2, don't forget to try the 2017 3DS title Metroid Samus Returns, which is an official remake of the original Game Boy sequel with awesome 2.5D graphics with many improvements and new abilities. Our next disappointing and near sickening moment in retro gaming took place while playing the puzzle adventure PC title named Myst. It was a beautifully designed first-person puzzle game from 1993 where you would travel to different worlds on the island of Myst through these magical linking books. In the main library of the island, there are 2 books on display that have brothers trapped inside of them. Cirrus is in the red book and Achenar is in the blue book. You listen to each of their pleas to get you to help free them from their book by collecting the missing pages from their own book scattered throughout the different worlds on the island. Both of them don't seem very trustworthy, but you know you have to help one of them. My dad and I played this game together from start to finish and we loved every minute of it. The puzzles were so rewarding and visually stunning for the time. We finally decided to go with saving Achenar from the blue book to find out that his plan was all along to trap us in the book once he was freed. So we were upset, but played through the game again to free Cirrus from the red book to find out once again that Cirrus trapped us in his book after we saved him. We about lost our minds. We felt like we had wasted so much time playing this game because it took us about a month with no tips or hints to reach this point. I mean, we had a great time playing, and every now and then my dad and I still talk about how much fun we had playing Myst, but that ending, oh my gosh. I happened to see an official strategy guide for Myst at our local AIM store a few months after, and realized there was a 3rd green book hidden behind this special door you had to unlock by putting in this secret code pattern in the library's fireplace. So I bought the strategy guide and my dad and I ran downstairs and got to see the true ending to Myst. And we finally got to close the book on this wonderful game. Up next is the first Nintendo console that didn't live up to my expectations, and that is the original Game Boy Color. Now before you think I'm crazy for saying this, just hear me out. It had been nearly a decade since the release of the original Game Boy with the way outdated baby puke green color palette. And Sega put out the Game Gear in 1991 with a backlit colored screen that was really great for the time. So when Nintendo finally released a color-based handheld in 1998, I was so pumped. Of course it was going to have new specially designed Game Boy Color titles, but it was also backwards compatible with the original Game Boy, and was supposed to add special color schemes to some popular Game Boy titles like Pokemon Yellow and Super Mario Land. I popped in my Mario Land cartridge, turned on the power, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, yes, there were now colors on a Game Boy, but there was still no backlight. Sega did this 7 years ago, and Nintendo still didn't think it would make the experience better. That meant you still had to find the perfect lighting or be right on top of a lamp in order to play, and this was almost the year 2000. I mean, yeah, it saves battery life to not have the light source, but it really sacrifices true portability in all settings. I love being able to play the Game Gear in the dark for a few minutes before bed or in the car at night, and it was pretty much impossible with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. I mean, Nintendo didn't even learn their lesson with their next handheld, the Game Boy Advanced either, cause it still didn't have a backlit screen. It wasn't until the Game Boy Advanced SP released in 2003 that they finally added a front-lit screen, and finally got me interested in their handhelds again. And as a side note, my NES-themed Game Boy Advanced SP is still one of my most prized items in my collection. But up until that point, the lack of a backlit screen on Nintendo handhelds just blew my mind. Number 5 is a game that was released the year I was born in 1982, but I didn't get a chance to play it until I bought it for $2 at a Big Lots store when I was about 10 years old. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but this game was actually supposed to be a big player in the infamous video game crash back in '83. And no, I'm not talking about E.T. on the Atari 2600. I mean, yeah, that game is not the best by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not the worst game of all time like many think. I even made a video a few months back about how I think it's not the worst game of all time. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out after this video. Now, the game I actually purchased that day that nearly brought down the entire video game industry was none other than PacMan for the Atari 2600. I was and still am a huge fan of the original PacMan arcade game, and would have never dreamed Atari would make a bad home port, but man was I wrong. I mean, this game is just atrocious. It just looks so awful compared to the arcade, and the tinny sounds the game makes are almost unbearable. But the worst part of the game is the constant flickering of the ghost. It's just so annoying. Apparently, the 2600 hardware was so inferior to the technology of the PacMan arcade board, which held 2 kilobytes of RAM to run the program, and another 2 kilobytes of video RAM, while the 2600 only had 128 bytes, which basically means it's 32 times less powerful than the arcade version. So lots of corners had to be cut to have it on the Atari, and it clearly shows. This game was actually the best-selling 2600 game of all time at 7 million copies, but many of these people were upset and returned the game after they brought it home, and it is still considered one of, if not the worst arcade port in video game history. Number 4 is the first gaming peripheral I really got duped by. and that is the U-Force on the NES. The U-Force was an IR sensor-based controller for the NES made by Broderbund. I saw the commercial for the U-Force back in '89 that has this guy playing some of my favorites like Top Gun and Rad Racer by just making hand gestures. But what really sealed the deal for me to get the U-Force was seeing this guy physically dodging and punching to control Little Mac on Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! When I finally got my U-Force, I was so pumped to see if I could beat up Glass Joe. Well, that didn't happen. I actually didn't even land one punch. This thing didn't work, period. And you had to set all these goofy switches on the bottom of the controller for certain games, and it just didn't even come close to working with any combination I used. And it came with this cheap and flimsy joystick controller with these flickering light sensor stickers on the bottom, which is really misleading compared to the commercial, which gives the illusion you only have to use your hands. Even the U-Force's own ad campaign said don't touch, and I guess I should have listened. Up next is another gaming peripheral that was officially licensed by Sega for the Game Gear. Sega took any chance they could get to remind you that the Game Boy didn't have a colored screen and the Game Gear did. To further twist the knife, they created the Game Gear TV tuner in 1991, which snapped in the cartridge slot so you could watch real TV channels using an analog tuner dial. I remember being so impressed by the handheld TV that Dustin Hoffman had in Rain Man, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on one of these. But sadly enough, when I did finally own the TV tuner, I couldn't get it to work no matter where I was, even if I was just at my house or even in a downtown city area near some local TV stations. So again, another gaming peripheral that just didn't work, and I should have known it was too good to be true. And ironically enough, I bought it at Kmart.
Tell him, Ray.
Kmart sucks.
I see.
My second most disappointing moment is what I believe was a huge step in the wrong direction for Sega during the early 90s, and that was the now infamous add-on for the Genesis, the 32X. Now, I was a Sega kid in the 90s. I mean, I didn't even own a Super Nintendo until I got one secondhand in college in the early 2000s. I was a huge fan of the Genesis and one of those few people who actually loved the Sega CD add-on and all those cheesy FMV titles. So when Sega came out with the 32X as a cheap add-on that would bring 32-bit graphics and exclusive games at a much lower price than the Atari Jaguar or the 3DO, I saved up my grass cutting and report card money and finally got one in 1995. I remember getting NFL Quarterback Club and WWF Raw, and I couldn't wait to see some 32-bit graphics when I got home. But I was shocked to find the graphics were very similar to my other Genesis games. It didn't feel like there was any change in the gaming experience whatsoever. And this thing was such a chore to set up. You had to put these awkward metal clips over the flaps of my Model 1 Genesis, and it had a bunch of clunky cords and was honestly kind of an eyesore. I wasn't aware of all the backstage politics at the time, but apparently the 32X was doomed for failure from the start because it was released in a short window in the early 90s just before the upcoming releases of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. So the large third-party developers like Konami and Capcom didn't want to waste time making games for just an add-on for an older console. Ultimately, only 40 games were released for the 32X. And they were all rushed and really didn't take full advantage of the hardware capabilities. And I felt like I wasted my money on this, and it really made me upset at Sega until the release of the Dreamcast. Now before we get to number 1, I'm going to introduce something new on the channel that I think you might enjoy. You may remember seeing a picture of me as a kid in a few of our past videos sporting my glorious golden mullet. Well, I thought it would be fun to see if I can hide this image, that will now be known as Mullet Boy, somewhere in each video, and the first person to find Mullet Boy and list the exact time and place you spot him in the comments will get a shout out in our next video. And Mullet Boy is actually hidden somewhere in this video, so make sure you watch closely the entire video. So it's finally down to my most disappointing moment in retro gaming, and it's when I thought it was a good idea to purchase the Sega Activator. The Activator was released in 1993 and was an officially licensed full-body motion-based controller for the Sega Genesis. It used an octagon frame you would place on the floor, and the box shows this kid doing martial arts style moves to control the game. And this was during the height of Mortal Kombat, and the Activator was even advertised as being compatible with the game. And I thought this was really going to be the future of gaming. The Activator worked by having a beam of light shoot up vertically from the floor in each of its 8 segments. The player stands in the center, and whenever a body part is passed over the light, it triggers a response in the game. It sounds cool in theory, but each light segment only controls the 4 directions of the D-pad, the ABC buttons, and the start button, so it's basically a giant control pad, and doesn't just recognize your body movements and emulate them on screen. But I guess I was a little naive to think that, but the game responses were so delayed, and most of the times your motions didn't even even register. You had to have almost perfect lighting conditions for the light sensors to work properly, and even everyday household items like ceiling fans would mess with the sensors, so it was a hugely flawed design. And I wish I would have got to see this before I paid $80 for this crap, which is still sitting in my parents' basement today and hasn't been touched for 25 years. I hope you enjoyed me reliving some of my painful gaming moments for this top 10, and I would love to hear any of your disappointing moments in retro gaming in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and make sure you share it with any of your retro gaming friends, and don't forget to be on the lookout for Mullet Boy for a chance to get a shout out in our next video. Until next time guys, G3 out.